I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. This is the second class in 4 classes that I'm going to be doing. Next week, I'm doing Where Art Thou, God, grappling with basically theology during this difficult time. And from a Jewish perspective, what does that look like? And then the last one is actually going to be before Lag BaOmer on May 6th, and it's called Plagues, Fires, Remembrance. And it looks at the idea of plagues and remembering during a plague, because Lag BaOmer is actually commemorating a plague. So it's a very interesting and apropos class for this time. So today you've all joined me because we're going to be learning about the Scourge of Plagues and anti-Semitism. So in full disclosure, my background is actually in anti-Semitism, which really sounds a little odd and strange, but my master's degree is in anti-Semitism and Jewish identity from Brandeis University. And so some of what you're going to be introduced to today is actually my master's thesis, because that's going to give an overarching view of anti-Semitism from a different perspective probably than you've ever been introduced to it before, but in a way that will probably click and make sense. And then we're going to be looking at the Black Death of 1347, 1348. And then we're going to finish with looking at COVID-19. And then finally, what we're going to do at the very end is we're actually going to look at ways that we can respond to anti-Semitism during our time frame right now. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a PowerPoint for tonight. And I'm going to move all of you over so I can see you all on my second monitor. So just know you're on my second monitor if I'm looking over here. For those of you who have never taken a class with me, if you're interested in seeing me and the shared screen at the same time, if you're on a computer, you can go ahead and at the top, you'll see a green like little line that says Yael Weinstein sharing, and then you'll see view options. You can choose in the view options, you can actually choose side-by-side view, and that way you can see everybody. And I'm going to put everybody on mute so that we can all hear the class. All right, so we're going to get started. Does anybody have any questions before I get started, though? Is everybody good? Okay, let's get started. So my theory of anti-Semitism is called the anti-Semitism equation. And the anti-Semitism equation looks at all the time periods of anti-Semitism, right? Where anti-Semitism equals Jew hatred in this concept of what we're talking about. So it looks at classical and pagan anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, Christian medieval, and then modern. And it also looks at the manifestations of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism exists in many different manifestations, right? So you have religious anti-Semitism, political, you have national, racial, anti-Zionist, economic, cultural. And what's really important is you see this really convoluted Venn diagram is that anti-Semitism can be expressed in terms of religion, or expressed in terms of politics, or expressed in terms of nationalism, or expressed in terms of racism, et cetera, but it can also be expressed in multiple ways within the same form of, same type of anti-Semitism. So often Nazi anti-Semitism, for example, is viewed as a racial anti-Semitism. But if you actually look at Nazi anti-Semitism, there's a national component to it, there's a political component to it, there's even religious undertones to the anti-Semitism that came from the Nazis. There's cultural, there's economic. The only one that really wasn't from the Nazis was anti-Zionism, because the state of Israel didn't exist at that time. So it's really important to understand that anti-Semitism can manifest itself in many ways within one group. So what makes anti-Semitism this long hatred, the scourge upon history, is really where my equation comes from. So imagine anti-Semitism equals, and I'm going to introduce you to 4 concepts that I'm then going to explain. So it's not going to make any sense when you first look at this, and that's okay for the next 10 minutes, and in 10 minutes it's going to all like click. So anti-Semitism equals something that is the non-Jewish dynamics, multiplied by the Jewish canvas, multiplied by historic iconography, which is then multiplied by accessibility. Now, imagine a multiplication problem. If 0 exists in your multiplication problem, then 0 will be the answer. If any other numbers exist and there's a 0, 0 will still be the answer. So to have an answer that is different than 0 in a multiplication problem, you have to have each of these being greater than 0, right? And so what happens is that if any part is much greater than 0, for example, then it becomes far more likely for anti-Semitism to exist and also be perpetrated against in terms of persecution, laws, and platforms and such that you see. Now, when I'm talking about anti-Semitism in terms of today and in terms of in general, I'm not talking about your anti-Semitic neighbor who's obnoxious, right? Although they can be part of this whole conversation. When I'm looking at the anti-Semitism equation, I'm really looking at the idea of anti-Semitism to such a level that there ends up being policy persecution and platforms that exist, political platforms exist, and what happens, or mob mentality. That's the kind of anti-Semitism that I'm diving deep into. So we have these 4 components. So if one of these 4 is 0, then the likelihood is you're not going to see a anti-Semitism that is expressed through policy, expressed through politics, expressed through a persecution, expressed through a genocide, whatever it is. You're not going to really see that. However, if all of these exist together, and the more they're expressed, the more that that's going to take place. So let's see what that means. So what are the non-Jewish dynamics? So anti-Semitism doesn't actually start with the Jew. Anti-Semitism starts with a group that defines themselves as us. And if I define me as me, then I have to define somebody else as them. So us versus them is the very basis of group identity and is the very start and the very foundation of anti-Semitism. So it's when you see us as self and them as other. And this term other is very important within this concept. The us that sees themselves as superior to the other. They don't want to belong to the group because they think it's horrible and less than the other. In fact, one of the few groups that I've ever met that actually is self-deprecating are Jews. But in general, people who want to belong to a group want to belong to the group because they see whatever it is as a superior group. So they see themselves as superior to their other. But they have a perceived threat. And what's really important about this perceived threat is that it's an existential threat. It is something that is so dangerous that if they don't do something about it, they are fearful that something very horrible is going to happen. So actually, if you look at our Nazi Germany example, in Nazi Germany, the existential threat was actually not the Jew. The existential threat was the communist Comintern concept, which was the communist movement was trying to take over all of the world. And by the Germans, that was the existential threat. But for whatever reason, those who see themselves as superior but simultaneously perceive an existential threat feel that they're unable to attack immediately their enemy, whatever that enemy is. Now, the enemy does not have to be a person. The enemy can be a thing. And we're going to see that play out with the bubonic plague or the Black Death of 1348, how the enemy is not actually another person, another place, another country. It's an intangible thing that they're trying to fight. So they're unable to attack the enemy either immediately, or they're unable to attack the entire enemy base. So that if they wanted to attack the enemy and cut it off at its knees, they're not able to because they're not strong enough, because they don't have the technology, because they don't understand how to do it. Whatever the reasons, they don't have enough money, whatever the reason is that they're unable to attack the entire base. So what does that group do? They begin a campaign by taking on another group. So they begin their attack by attacking others. So others that are easier to attack. So typically minorities that are easier to persecute, easier to try and manipulate, easier to put policies against because nobody's willing to defend them. And then those groups, those others, are used as practice to build the technology, to build the systems needed to actually attack that perceived existential threat. And I want to go back to the perceived existential threat because I think perceived is one of the most important parts of that. It doesn't have to be real. It doesn't have to be a real threat for there to be a group that is frightened by something. And you can see this play out, not to get into politics, so this is from a non-political perspective, but you can see this play out in politics all the time, where even though something is truly not an existential threat, people perceive it thus and create rhetoric around it to make it seem like it is an us versus them existential dilemma. So what is the Jewish canvas part of the equation? So we have anti-Semitism equals non-Jewish dynamics, and now we're on to the Jewish canvas. So the question is, who is a Jew? So the Jew is really interesting because the Jew has lived all over the world, mostly because of persecution migration, meaning they're moving specifically because they're being persecuted from one place to the next, to the next, to the next. And they're looking to improve their lot in life, typically because they are being persecuted. So they're going from one place to the other. And by doing that, they live in those countries and they become partially assimilated into the society that they are. So we, as American Jews, by and large, look American. German Jews looked German. You have Ethiopian Jews look Ethiopian. You have Jews, for example, who are in Russia, who are more Russian. So depending on what the nature is, you have differences with, hold on 2 seconds, I'm admitting somebody. So you have people look like these different countries because they've partially assimilated, but simultaneously they're not fully assimilating into the society. They still remain clearly Jewish. And by remaining clearly Jewish, they become a model for the other. So it's easy to say, well, they're still a Jew, and therefore they can model the other. And what does that mean? For example, if you are existentially perceived as an existential threat, the communists, and you see that there are Jews who are communists, they can represent that existential threat or the communists. If you claim that the existential threat is capitalist, there are Jews who are capitalists. So you can use the Jews as the model for that existential threat. If you want to say that the Jews are Black, there are Black Jews. If you want to say there are Arab Jews, there are Arab Jews. If you want to call Jews white, and as an existential threat whites, you can call them white Jews. So whatever that existential threat is, you have the ability to use them as a model. And the last part that is really important about the Jewish canvas is the Jews are not strong enough to actually do anything, by and large, historically, about the anti-Semitism being perpetrated against them. So by and large, what that meant is the Jews weren't able to defend themselves against these attacks by this group that perceived themselves as superior, while simultaneously perceiving an existential threat. I'm going to pause there for 2 seconds. Does anybody have any questions yet? That's a lot of information that I just threw at you. All right, Ginny's giving me a thumbs up. Nobody's raising their hand, so I'm going to continue. All right, so now we're on to the historic iconography. It's a big term, historic iconography. So what I want you to think of when you think of iconography is think of the American flag. Whether you perceive the American flag as just something that is red and white stripes, and then a 50 stars, you know that that's an American flag. But you can see a cake that has frosting with raspberries on it and blueberries, and you know that's an American flag. Julio, I see you. Give me 2 seconds. So what happens is that iconography is you see an image and you immediately think to yourself, oh, that represents this. If I see an eagle, it might represent America. If I see the Statue of Liberty, even if it's not fully designed and carved out, you know that if she's holding her hand and like this, there is that iconography to it. So historic iconography is the building up layer by layer by layer by layer by layer by layer, this perception of what something is. And the historic iconography of anti-Semitism literally starts with the first time periods when there was anti-Jewish sentiment, which actually, for example, the first blood libel is during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes during the Hasmonean era of the 160s BCE, so before the Common Era. And that built itself up higher and higher and higher as it went. So the historic iconography has built itself into this long story. So we all perceive, for example, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as the basis of Jewish world domination conspiracy, when in fact the first world Jewish conspiracy was in 1144 during the Crusades. It was actually not during the Protocols of the Elders of Zion during 1917. So that is all part of the historic iconography. So what I want to ask before you read this is, to all of you, what is the perception of a Jew according to anti-Semitism? When I say the word Jew, and you're thinking of it from an anti-Semitic perspective, what are the words that you think about? And you can go ahead and unmute yourself and just, say the words that come to mind, if you have any that come to mind. And then Julio, I'll take your question. Does anybody have any?
Wealthy, smart.
Wealthy, smart. Julio?
No, I just had a question on, hold on, let me.
We own the media.
We own the media. Okay,
and
what
the
else?
banks. And the banks.
We own the banks, we own the media. What else?
Miserly.
Say that again.
Miserly.
Miserly, great. What else? Not great, but yes. What else?
Religious.
Religious, what else?
Cheap.
Cheap. What kind of facial features do we have?
Big noses.
Big noses.
Dark.
Dark. What else?
Features.
Payout.
What? Payout. Yeah. What else? Do we smell good?
No.
Are we nice?
No.
Are we vicious?
Yes.
Yeah. We control the banks. We're vicious, right? These are all these terms. I didn't have to tell you. All I said is, what is a Jew according to Anti-Semites? And you were able to tell me what it was, right? That's because that's the historic iconography. That's what I'm talking about. Those layers and layers of what a Jew is perceived of without ever actually having to say, that's a Jew.
Oh, and killed Christ.
Automatically, and you killed Christ, right? That's automatically a Jew. Now, does everybody who think that, does that make them an anti-Semite? No, because that's the historic iconography that was created. If you act on it and you believe it as a negative thing, does that make you an anti-Semite? Yes. And what does that mean? It means there are people who are taught that Jews have horns, right? You've heard that. But that doesn't mean that they really believe that or they've been taught that. And there's a difference between what is being taught and what is being believed. Does that make sense what I'm saying? The difference? And that's hard. That's a really hard concept to realize, that there's a difference between somebody who has anti-Semitic thoughts because they've been raised and steeped in it, and somebody who actually has anti-Semitic thoughts because they're truly an anti-Semite and hates the Jews and wants to destroy the Jews, okay? There's a difference. One can be taught, wait, that's not reality, right? Like this, Jews control the blank, that's not true. Horns, do you see them? I don't have them. I just have puffy hair, right? But to the other, that can't be taught away. That's a belief that they hold to them. Do you guys see the difference between that? Yeah? I know that's difficult to deal with. Julio, go ahead. You had a question.
No, I was going to say it depends probably on, I guess, different societies. I think we're talking mostly about anti-Semitism for the most part in Europe, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and a little bit in the Middle East. And I guess it's societies that, again, they build this iconography and this tradition and this
That's right.
history, again, over the centuries. And it's almost impossible to unlearn that, I think. It's like, we mentioned this before,
So
you know,
that's,
they become addicted to this notion, and it's impossible.
that's right.
You
So
know,
the
how are you going to
historic
teach?
iconography can never be zero, Julio.
Yeah.
Because the historic iconography exists. That's the one that we cannot cross out. So if we
Yeah.
know that one can't be zero, one of the things we're going to talk about what can. We're also not going to zero out the Jews, right? The Jewish canvas, because that's who we are as a people. So we're not going to cross out the Jewish canvas, and we're not going to cross out historic iconography. So we already know that each of those at least have a numeric value of some sort. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I have these two quotes. I'm going to put this out there right now. Not all Christians are anti-Semites, clearly. Not all Muslims are anti-Semites, clearly. We know that. The reason I brought these two quotes, one is from the New Testament and one is from the Quran, is to show you that there's historic iconography that started from biblical and religious sources that present the Jews in a particular light. And that is the basis of some of this historic iconography. The iconography, for example, that Jews killed Christ. Does every Christian believe that? No. There's Christian dispensationalism that doesn't perceive Jews as responsible for killing Christ. That this is Christ was killed, and there was there were Jews to this story, but that doesn't mean that all Jews that exist from that time on is responsible for that decision, right? However, what it means is if this is in the story, that means historic iconography becomes very difficult to stop this conversation because it's in very important books for people that read the tradition. Telling Christians that they should not have this in their New Testament is like telling us to edit the Torah. We're not editing the Torah. They're not editing the New Testament. The Muslims are not going to edit the Quran. Nobody's taking, a red pen and saying, oh, sorry, that can't be there. It's like us being like, you can't have Lot incestuous relationship with his daughters in the Bible just because. It's not happening. The question is how it's used. And that's when you have to look at the building of iconography, right? So how is it that you of your father is the devil? It's not about that being used in the text. It's how is that being used later on to perpetrate anti-Semitism, okay? That doesn't make something, this is not anti-Semitism, but this is used as a proof text as to why to be an anti-Semite by certain subsections of populations that believe in either Islam or believe in Christianity throughout history, okay? Now, let's look. Does anybody have any questions about that up to this point? Okay, so now we're going to go on to the next. So what does that mean? What does anti-Semitism look like when you build the historic iconography? It means that we start having things like this. This is a picture of a baby who is being drained for blood on what holiday?
Passover.
Passover. For what reason? What is this?
We drink it.
We drink it. It's a blood libel, okay? You can still see this image on a medallion in Italy, in a square in Italy. That doesn't go away. It's not there. So what happens? Now we have another layer of iconography that isn't going away. All right, so let's add another layer. What's this?
Bringing Jesus to, what's his name?
Yeah, so this is bringing Jesus to his death, right? To be crucified. And what do the Jews look like?
Noses.
Yeah, that nose, that big hooked nose imagery comes all the way.
How come Jesus doesn't have a nose?
Well, so Jesus has a nose, but he doesn't have the hook nose, right?
Right. That's what I mean.
He doesn't have this Jewish look to him, right? He has the saint crown. Is it a halo, Jenny and Jackie? Is that right? The halo? Yeah. Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So then let's look at the next layer. So then the next layer is the Judenschau. This is called a Judenschau. What's happening in this picture?
I assume the guy in black is a Jew.
He is a Jew. How do we know he's a Jew?
Because he looks, dark.
Okay. What else do we see on him that would make him look like a Jew?
I can't tell if he's got a nose.
A black hat?
It's the hat, and what else is he wearing? What else is on his black cloak?
You can't tell what that is. The little thing on his sleeve?
Yeah, this circle. This was the Jew badge. So the yellow star that the Nazis made Jews wear is not a new concept. The Jews used to have to wear the Jew badge. And the Jew badge is not only on him, but it's on this guy. And notice it's on this devil. The Jew badge is also on this guy. So this is the iconography that Jews have. Horns, okay? What are they doing? Do you guys see?
Arguing.
Okay, so it looks like they're arguing. What are they at? Look at what they're actually doing. Look at what one guy is sitting on the pig.
Oh, there's a kid under being nourished, no, or something
So
like that.
there's a kid suckling the tits of the pig.
Yeah.
This guy is holding the tail of the pig so that this guy can do what? Yeah, it's not pleasant. So this guy is actually licking the butthole of the pig. Okay. The Judenschau is a typical image found in Germany. You can still see Judenschaus carved out in Germany today, and there are arguments as whether they should be taken down or left out. The Judenschau used to be on the Bromberg Bridge all the time. Okay, let's add the next layer of iconography. What's this?
We own the world.
We own the world. And what do we look like?
A snake.
The devil.
A snake.
Pointed ears.
Sneaky, sly.
Snake, sly, Slytherin. This is the cover of one version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Oh, really?
And what's this?
Dark.
Dark. Is it nice?
No.
Would you want to be in an alley with this guy?
No.
No.
It's sinister. This is a Nazi poster. Notice what's happening in all these pictures. Do you see women?
No.
Are Jews women?
No.
No, I don't see them.
They're all men. They're all men. There's very few Anti-Semitic, Anti-Semitica out there that have women. Very few. And then the last image is one from about 2010. This image was taken.
Oh, Gaza.
That you can see from here. Coming into anti-Semitism with the idea of killing people and committing genocide in Gaza. Do you see how this story builds on itself? It builds on itself. That's historic iconography. That's what I'm talking about. It builds layer upon layer upon layer, and it snowballs. And you cannot zero out historic iconography. You can improve people's perception of the Jews, but it doesn't take away these negative stereotypes that exist within society at the same time. So one of the questions about how do you take action is how do you try and minimize this negative perception? And we'll get to that in a little bit. So the last part of the equation is accessibility. Where are the Jews? So it used to be in order to kill a Jew or to put political policies on Jews, you had to have Jews in your country, and to kill a Jew, you had to what? You had to physically be able to touch a Jew, right? With the advent of guns, what were you able to do then? Shoot a Jew, okay? And then with the advent of even more technology, all you had to do was take a Jew and shove them in a gas chamber. And you didn't even have to do it because you used other Jews to do it. And then, now, what do you have to do to kill a Jew? You drop a bomb.
Drop a bomb.
Or use an incendiary device of some sort. So accessibility has become much more global as we have become a more global society, okay? That's the equation. Does anybody have any questions about the equation? Because now we're going to look at 1348 and how that plays out in 1348. Okay. So Black Death happened in 1348. And what that meant with the Black Death happening in 1348 is actually much like our current our current pandemic. It started beforehand in other places, but it reached its height in Europe in 1348. It started, they don't believe, they know it started in the 1330s in China and went through to the Mongols. And the Mongols came in 1347 attacking and trying to conquer Europe through the Black Sea, and would capitulate dead bodies that have of individuals who had died because of the Black Death, and would capitulate them over to the enemy lines. And that meant that Italian shipmen brought back the Black Death to European soil. A third to 60% of the populations of each country affected by the Black Death were killed because of this disease. In Germany, where there was the least affected, 1.2 million people perished of the Black Death. 42,800,000, so almost 43 million people died of the Black Death between its inception in the 1330s until it finally lost steam in the 15th century, excuse me, I just gave you the wrong date, 15th century. During that time, that 43 million people in the world perished, the people were afraid. There was economic downturn. They didn't know why people were dying. They were trying to figure it out, and they were trying to make sense of it. Statistics, who kept statistics, Julio? From what I've seen, this is from research that was done in terms of populations in towns and stuff, is my understanding about the statistics of where it was from, and from looking at population growth and bones and stuff is my understanding. If I'm wrong with that, I apologize in terms of the statistics. Does that answer your question? Can you give me a thumbs up if that answers your question, or have Vicky give a thumbs up? Yes? Okay, perfect. All right. So, yes, it's the best we can do, for sure. So reasons for the plague were perceived as, they were trying to understand the reasons for the plague. So there were those who had scientific reasons. So they thought it could be, that the air could be poisoned, that wells could be poisoned. They thought it was caused maybe by earthquakes. They thought it was from planetary configurations. They believed there were 7 planets, and the way they were aligned led to the plague. They thought, some of them thought it was transmitted by imagination, and some people thought it was even transmitted by sight. And so what they would do is all different things, like you weren't supposed to bathe, and you weren't supposed to have intercourse, and you weren't supposed to do a whole bunch of rituals. You weren't supposed to look at people, some people believe, because it would turn that as well. And then some people turned to religious reasons. They thought that this was God's wrath because people were turning from God, away from God, and that this was leading to the end of times, right? So if you read in Revelations, in the New Testament, this concept kind of felt like it fit this era when people were dying all around you. There was economic downturn. People were at a loss to why this horrific thing was happening. Science wasn't at the level that we have it now, and you can see even now it's not like the best science we've ever had. Like we're not at a scientific place where we have an immediate turnaround to a cure. So imagine when we didn't have all the science we have now, how scary this must seem, right? Imagine COVID-19 without any of our scientific ability to test, without our scientific ability to send information, to quarantine, whatever it is. So what ended up happening is to quarantine people. They would actually take the people who were dead sometimes and throw them out into fields and let them die. And if you went and tried to help the people who were dying, your stuff would be confiscated by the state because you were basically putting other people at risk. And if you came into contact that somebody who ended up with the plague, you were actually forced into seclusion for a minimum of 10 days. So they had these ways that they were trying to save the people. So what is this end of times concept? Because we have to look at this, right? To understand this non-Jewish dynamics part. Is what happened during the time of the Black Plague is there were a group of people who perceived themselves as superior. There were a group of Christians who perceived themselves as superior and believed those who did not believe in God and Christ were inferior. And they perceived a threat that was existential, which was not another country or population, but the Black Death. They couldn't fight it because they didn't know how to fight it. And therefore they turned on people who were others. And that meant turning on poor, turning on people who didn't believe, turning on Jews. So they believed the ends of times was coming, that there would be an emergence of a great leader, that the emperor of the last days who would destroy the heathens and institute a period of harmonious rule on earth, and that during his reign, hosts of Gog and Magog, the enemies of Christ, would be unleashed from hell, bringing drought, famine, war, plague, and universal destruction. And there was plague, and there were wars, and people were dying. And therefore they thought this was representative of the end of days. The emperor would journey to Jerusalem where he would surrender his crown and die, ushering in the reign of the Antichrist, the last triumph of evil before the second coming. There would be vicious persecution of Christians, apostasy of many of them, leaving only a faithful remnant. The idea would be Enoch and Elisha would then appear and convert the apostates. The Antichrist would attempt his own accession from the Mount of Olives. The devil would drop him and he would fall his death. And 15 signs of the end of the world and the coming of Christ would occur. And one of the last components would the Jews had to be converted or murdered before Christ could come. So what ended up happening is that the Jews were blamed for the plague. The society thought that the wells were being poisoned, and who was doing the poisoning was the Jews. So this is a text that was kept, and this is the translation in English, and we're going to go ahead and read this right now. Did I misspell famine? I might have missed, yes, I meant famine, not feminine. Sorry, I misspelled it. All right, Lorraine, do you mind reading for me? I'm going to take you off of mute. I'm going to let you take yourself off of mute. Is it working? Yeah. Okay.
On Friday, the 10th of the month of October at Châtel, in the castle thereof, there occurred the judicial inquiry, which was made by order of the court of the illustrious Prince, our Lord, Amadeus, Count of Savoy, and his subjects against the Jews of both sexes who were there imprisoned, each one separately. Jews were sometimes imprisoned separately to prevent suicide. This was done after public rumor had become current and a strong clamor had arisen because of the poison put by them into the wells, springs, and other things which the Christians use, demanding that they die. That they are able to be found guilty and, therefore, that they should be punished. Hence, this their confession made in the presence of a great many trustworthy persons. Agabent the Jew, who lived at Geneva and was arrested at Châtel, was there put to the torture a little, and then he was released from it. And after a long time, having been subjected again to torture a little, he confessed in the presence of great many trustworthy persons who are later mentioned. To begin with, it is clear that at Lent, just past, Pontius Place de Rans had sent this very Jew to Venice to buy silks and other things for him. When this came to the notice of Rabbi Peret, a Jew of, what is it?
Chambéry.
Chambéry, who was a teacher of their law, he sent for this, is it Agamet?
Sandrine, you know how to pronounce that, right?
Argument, yes.
Yeah.
For whom he had searched, and when he had come before him, he said, "We have been informed that you are going to Venice to buy silk and other wares. Here, I am giving you a little package of a half a span in size, which contains some prepared poison and venom in a thin, sewed leather bag. Distribute it among the wells, cisterns, and springs about Venice and the other places to which you go, in order to poison the people who use the water of the aforesaid wells that will have been poisoned by you, namely the wells in which the poison will have been placed."
So what is this? What are we reading? Is this just a random Jew who decided to poison the wells?
Well,
What is this?
it's like a confession.
A false confession, right?
It's a forced confession of a conspiracy, right? Of a world conspiracy, right? Of a rabbi who told the Jew to poison the wells. So it wasn't a rabbi from Geneva. It was a rabbi from Venice who told the Jews in Geneva to poison the wells. So the idea that the Protocols of the Elders design is the first world Jewish conspiracy, that's not true. And you can see this here, right? It started before then. So let's continue on. So the Jews are poisoning the wells and they're being tortured. That's why they're confessing, because they're being tortured. So let's read what he ended up doing. Lorraine, do you mind reading?
No, of course not. Agamet took this package full of poison and carried it with him to Venice. And when he came there, he threw and scattered a portion of it into the well or cistern of fresh water, which was there near the German house, in order to poison the people who use the water of that cistern. And he says that this is the only cistern of sweet water in the city. He also says that the mentioned Rabbi Peret promised to give him whatever he wanted for his troubles in this business. Of his own accord, Agamet confessed further that after this had been done, he left at once in order that he should not be captured by the citizens or others, and that he went personally to Calabria and Apula and threw the above-mentioned poison into many wells. He confesses also that he put some of this same poison in the well of the streets of the city of Balais. He confesses further that he put some of this poison into the public fountain of the city of Toulouse and in the wells that are near the Mediterranean Sea. Asked if at that time that he scattered the venom and poisoned the wells above mentioned, any people had died, he said that he did not know, inasmuch as he had left every one of the above mentioned places in a hurry. Asked if any of the Jews of those places were guilty in the above mentioned matter, he answered that he did not know. And now by all that which is contained in the 5 books of Moses and the scroll of the Jews, he declared that this was true and that he was in no wise lying, no matter what might happen to him.
Okay, so the Jews are basically accused of this. And what the image that I have behind all my slides is actually an image from the Black Death of them burning the Jews in at the stake. And we're not going to read this text, but it goes on to talk about the same kind of thing where Jews are being burned and they're being tortured and they're being killed. And then the last one, for example, is this one where you can actually see a skeleton that they found from is this French, Sandrine?
No, I think it's Spanish.
Spanish, Les Roquetes Tarrega. And you can see that the person who passed away was killed by an object that pierced the skull right there, okay? So the Jews were, inflicted with significant amount of horror on them. And there were some societies that tried to protect them and some societies that turned against them. Some magistrates that worked towards protecting the Jews. The Pope tried to protect the Jews. Some of the kings tried to protect the Jews, and then some did not. And after some of the Jews perished, and after these persecutions and these killings, there were some consequences to some of those societies. In certain places, people were fined. In certain places, people were locked up and put on trial. But by and large, they ended up being exonerated of their sins. So that's the Black Plague. So let's look at COVID-19 today. All right. So we all know what COVID-19 is, so I'm not explaining to you what COVID-19 is. But here is a tweet from COVID-19. Jacqueline, do you mind reading this?
I have to unmute myself. Well, you want me to read his name first?
You're more than welcome to.
Assad Abu Khalil says, tweets, Israel will, I am sure, have different medical procedures for Jews and non-Jews. Non-Jews will be put in mass prisons. And then Israel Hayom English writes back, hashtag Israel may impose quarantine on all those returning from abroad. Hashtag Netanyahu says amid growing concerns of hashtag coronavirus.
So the way that basically this tweet is included, right, is that Assad, this guy Assad, shared Israel Hayom's tweet,
right,
saying, well, I'm sure that there will be a different treatment between the Jews and the non-Jews, right? And what will happen to the non-Jews, according to this tweet?
They put in mass prisons.
They're going to be put in mass prisons, right? All right, let's look at the next. So this is by Pastor Rick Wiles. Who would like to read this? Ginny, do you mind reading it?
Sure. Stay out of those things. There's a plague in them. God's dealing with false religions. God's dealing with people who oppose his son, Jesus Christ. He's dealing with the forces of Antichrist. And there's a plague moving upon the earth right now. And the people that are going into the synagogues are coming out of the synagogues with the virus. It's spreading in Israel through the synagogues. Let me tell you, Mr. Netanyahu, let me tell you, ADL, God. God is spreading it in your synagogues. You're under judgment because you oppose his son, the Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay, so we see this. Now let's see another layer. And do you see how this is the historic iconography building? Does it mean that everybody who believes in Christianity is an anti-Semite? No, it does not. Does it mean that every Muslim is an anti-Semite? No. But do you see how the historic iconography is being used from history to push an agenda in the present? Do you see how that happens? Okay.
Yes.
So here's another tweet. So Jackie, do you mind reading these tweets?
Sure, from the gray area. The Jews invented hashtag coronavirus. And from Mohammed Afnan, nice job, Israel, creating the, I can't see that last word.
Antidote.
Antidote after creating the disease.
Okay. So what are the Jews being blamed for?
Creating it and solving it?
Creating it and solving it. But so what are they benefit? They created it to destroy people, and then they're creating a solution. So what can they get?
To save themselves.
Gain.
Gain.
Okay.
Right? So that they can benefit from it. Okay. So let's look at this one. What's this? This one is hard to see. This is from Hamburg, Nordmiete, and it says coronavirus. And what is it in? The Jew star, right? The Union star. And then this is from Ohio. So, Vicki, do you want to read this one?
Hundreds of, sorry about that. Hundreds of protesters gathered outside the Ohio State House on Saturday, April 18th, 2020, calling for state officials to lift restrictions now, including this car with an anti-Semite sign.
And what is the sign?
Anti-Semitic sign, and the sign reads "The real plague," and there is a rat or something like that, right?
And what does the rat have on him?
It's horrendous.
A kippah.
A kippah. The rat has a kippah on him. And what else?
The Jewish star, and it represents the flag of Israel.
Yeah, and what are, Sandrine, you had said earlier the Jew has the what? The payas? Yeah, and there, do you see that there's the payot right there?
Yeah.
Right, and the beard, right? And the Jews are being, and the kippah, right. The Jews are being blamed for it. So in addition to all this, so the Jews are basically being blamed by people who are anti-Semitic, not all society, but people who are anti-Semitic, for causing the current coronavirus. This is the story, right? They caused the current coronavirus. They created the virus. They're spreading the virus, right? Because they're having it in more numbers. Like in England, I think it's like 5% of the population, Jewish population had it, but versus like they're less than 1% of the population. So it's, the Jews are having it, right? It's happening to them because they're not believing in Jesus on one narrative. It's happening to them on another narrative because they hate the non-Jews. The anti-Israel narrative, right, is because they hate the non-Jews. And then they're trying to gain from it by creating the antidote, which is that money one, right? And simultaneously, who's the real plague? Who's the yucky, nasty, ugly, horrible people? Who is it? It's the Jews. Okay?
The religious
people, according to the magazine in the forward, some people were even calling for people to wear a patch that looked like the letter C sewn into those infected with the virus. Okay? So what happens, there was a gentleman who threatened to bomb a Jewish nursing home in Massachusetts. There were threats of Lakewood Jews in Lakewood, New Jersey, that a guy was going to come and attack them with a baseball bat. So you see this happening again. Is it happening to the point of burning at the stakes and attacks like it was? No, it hasn't happened like that. However, is there this mob anti-Semitism mentality in some parts of the population? Yes. So the question becomes, based off of now, and then there's Zoom bombing, right? We know what Zoom bombing is, people coming in. That's why Melissa right now is kind of acting like my gatekeeper with the waiting room, that there are people coming on saying horrific anti-Semitic stuff, exposing themselves, doing horrible, like pornographic stuff on, and making it difficult, right, to run Zoom meetings for Jewish people. So the question is, what are our responses? So understanding the equation, you can't zero out the Jewish canvas, and you can't zero out the historic iconography. And in all honesty, access is hard to zero out too. So the area that you really have to work is that first part, that non-Jewish dynamics, where you need to combat, and by doing that is you need to reinforce the idea of people having positive group identity with tolerance, without having this group identity that is based off of negativity towards people who are other. So to perceive themselves as an us without wanting to destroy the them. That also means that we have to strengthen the Jewish community using multiple tools too, right? We have to strengthen who we are as a people to be able to respond to things. Knowing the resources we have at our disposal, whether that is to go to people who have the resources like the ADL, teaching positive, affirming Jewish identity to our children and to ourselves. There's all different ways to do that. Now, because historic iconography can't disappear, one of the things we have at our disposal is to mitigate the historic iconography, right? So try and mitigate those negative stereotypes, fight those negative stereotypes, tell people it's not okay to use those negative stereotypes and that historic iconography. We need to also, in some ways, prevent access. So what did we do with Zoom bombing? So we didn't stop having classes. We made it harder for people to enter who want to Zoom bomb. And these are basically the things we have at our disposal. This is our toolkits that we have at our disposal to be able to do something. So I'm going to stop the slideshow. So I'm going to stop my share, bring you all back into gallery mode. Does anybody have any last minute? I see Vicky has a question. Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, well, when you said about the Zoom bombing, these things happen in pretty much all the companies that are running meetings with Zoom. Why do you think that is more particularly geared toward the Jewish institutions? I mean, when someone will try to hack a system, a computer system, usually they try to go to the sort of the probe the weakest. How do they know that we are the Jewish institutions?
So I don't think that it's necessarily only to know that we're the weakest. I think it's also that they have their anti-Semitic beliefs, so they were targeting Jews, hoping they were also weaker. And what happened is when the Jews were targeted, they weren't targeted with just pornography or some other negative hate. They were targeted with anti-Semitic hate. I'm assuming, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming if you ask groups who run LGBTQ groups, their Zoom bombing would look less anti-Semitic and more anti-LGBTQ. And if you ask the Black community, it would be more racially motivated, right? But that's that a group that sees themselves as us is attacking, and what do they do? They go into and find all the others and attack the others. Anti-Semitism never happens with anti-Semitism alone. Nazi Germany didn't happen with just anti-Semitism. Nazi Germany happened with being against communist political dissidents. It happened against those who were crippled, those who had mental health issues, those who had genetic diseases, those who had who were LGBTQ, right? It never happens that it's only one group, ever. And it doesn't change the fact that the Jews are many times like the first group, but it's not the only group. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we're technically 1 minute over, but I'll take one more question if there's anybody who has a question or comment. Yeah, Lori?
Remember with one of the pictures you had said, like during Nazi Germany, that the patch, it went back to, I think there was like a button on. Or,
yeah,
or
the Juden the circle, the Jew
When
patch.
did that start? You know, as far as, when are we talking? What
So
time?
you have it in, it's interesting because it didn't just start in one place. That's the interesting thing, right? So it was in Germany during the Middle Ages, and I can't remember the exact date right off the top of my head, so I apologize for that. But you also had it in Muslim societies. They forced Jews to wear special clothing as well. So clothing is an easier identifier. Mm-hmm. So it was very common for societies to force something on people to be easily identified. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Jacqueline, so Julio writes, badges, pointy hats, etc. Yeah. Jacqueline, what do you mean, what resources are there in terms of like ADL, like that kind of stuff? So we have the Anti-Defamation League, which is a phenomenal resource. They have a lot of stuff on their website, but they also have, they have representatives here. We have the JCRC, for example, which enables us to lobby, to use our voices in the political discourse. You can, if you hear things that are anti-Semitic, you can reach out to congressmen, both at the state and national level. You can write letters to people. You can go to lobby days. You can a strong resource is teaching our children and our youth to believe in themselves and to be strong and affirming Jews. You don't see this a lot, that Jewish children are able to go to campuses, for example, where there is anti-Semitism and actually be able to respond in a way that supports themselves and affirms themselves while protecting themselves. So the AJC has stuff. The Jewish Federation offers, classes and everything. Jewish summer camps, interestingly enough, are phenomenal for building Jewish identity, having a positive Jewish identity. So when I look at anti-Semitism, a lot of people, when they look at anti-Semitism, they say you just need to combat the negative, but you also have to promote the positive. You have to do both together. And promoting the positive means promoting a positive Jewish identity in those who are Jewish and around the world, to make people realize that Jews are just people and that there's many positive components. And educating people when they have misconceptions of Jews is really important. It also means not getting upset when people make stupid comments that might be anti-Semitic, but they aren't anti-Semites. And that's really hard, right? That's really, really hard. But it's recognizing that just because somebody is taught one way doesn't make them an anti-Semite. They can be educated and learn from you. And that's really important. So for example, in the LDS Church, there are people who do posthumous baptisms, and Jews are really, really offended by it and say it's anti-Semitism. But if you really learn about why they do posthumous baptism, and then you teach them why it's not okay for us and why it's really offensive to us, their response is usually quite positive, to be like, oh, we understand, right? And you can come to a place where you can talk. But you have to be willing to educate people and not to immediately knee-jerk reaction and think everything negative is definitely 100% anti-Semitic. So it's being able to discern what's the difference between an educational and teachable moment and anti-Semitism, which is not going to be teachable and is dangerous. Do you see the difference? And you have to teach the people who are educatable and can change, so that they don't get educated to kill you and to hurt you because of those ideas that they had been raised with. Because not every German was an anti-Semite, right? But there were enough anti-Semites that then taught their vitriol to the German society that enough of those people who weren't really anti-Semitic at first, but had some anti-Semitic historic iconography in their collective memory, that they became complacent and allowed this to happen, Does that make sense? It's a very hard, it's hard, but I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, Al.
Yeah.
In today's world, I read a very interesting article. The main doctor at the Nazareth Hospital was so positive in his talk about Israel and all Israel has done for the Palestinians.
That's
during this.
phenomenal.
It was such a beautiful article to read. And then I think of, I don't remember what his name is, I couldn't pronounce it anyway, from the PA, I assume, who talked negatively about what Israel was doing with the Palestinians. But it was just so beautiful to read what this doctor had to say.
Yeah.
It was really something. So there is a chance.
There is a chance, and that's why I promote the positive. And hopefully that sticks with you, right? Because we need to, and we need to do that. We need to promote the positive, yes. And teaching that complacency is not okay, that you can't, Julio just wrote that we need to teach that complacency is not okay, that we have to not just be willing to be quiet and keep our heads down because it will go away. Things don't go away when you stick your head in the sand. It just makes you get buried quicker. So
thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. I hope that you have a relaxing rest of your evening, because I know this is not the most relaxing class that you've ever taken in your life. But thank you all for coming.
It was great, Yael. Thank you so much for doing it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Good. I'm happy. Good.